Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Muhammad Irfan Memorial Lecture. Starting from 2015, the PSDE at its annual conferences has been hosting memorial lectures to honor the distinguished economist who served in PIDE and contributed to its status of being the premier research institute of economics in Pakistan. This year's lecture is to honor the contributions of Dr. Muhammad Irfan, who passed away almost a year ago on December 21, 2016. When I joined PIDE, my first assignment at PIDE was with Dr. Irfan. Working with him, I found out that he was a brilliant economist, but apart from being a brilliant economist, he was a very humble man, as true intellectuals are. And he had a humorous side to his personality, which I'm sure would be reflected upon by Sayyid Mubashir Ali, who had long association with Dr. Irfan at PIDE. Now I invite Mubashir Saab to say a few words in honor of Dr. Muhammad Irfan.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm really happy that this session is dedicated to Dr. Muhammad Irfan, a brilliant economist. Anyway, I will start. It's an honor and privilege for me to introduce Dr. Muhammad Irfan, with whom my friendship span has been for more than 4 decades. We both joined PIDE in 1973. He as staff economist and me as staff demographer. The journey of our friendship ended with the sad demise of Dr. Irfan on 21st January 2016, as has been already said, May Allah grant him a place in Jannah. Ameen. A silver lining in Dr. Irfan's life was that although throughout he was active and productive, he also enjoyed quality time with his family and with his grandchildren. This I am saying because I had family relationship with Dr. Irfan, and he is also my neighbor in F11. His colleagues and friends will agree with me that in the academic field, he was a thorough professional and earned a name among a few of the top economists of Pakistan. He was a voracious reader and has a library of about 4,000 books and documents in the basement of his house. Once I asked him that you have studied in a village Urdu medium school, how come your English is so good? He replied that from childhood he has been reading novels and fictions of English language, So that was, his success of getting a good English. Dr. Irfan was a gold medalist from Peshawar University and earned another master's degree and PhD from Cornell University. To his credit, there are 49 research reports, 33 articles published in national and international journals, and 4 books and monographs. Dr. Irfan retired in the year 2000 from PIDE as joint director. The expertise and services of Dr. Irfan were required by many national and international organizations. To name a few are Joint Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance from 1986 to 1988. Chief Technical Advisor on a UNFPA ILO project in Khartoum, Sudan, 1990-91. Chief Technical Advisor on UNDP ILO project on Labor Market Information System in Namibia, February 1992 to November 1994. ILO International Consultant on project entitled Sectoral Employment Policy and Planning in Indonesia, June 1995 to December 1995. Project Coordinator on Census Data Analysis, a UNST/UNFPA and PIDE project, December 2001 to December 2003. He also taught MA courses to students in International Islamic University, Islamabad, and Sarhad University, Peshawar. Those were the few credentials of him which I thought I must convey to you, and that reflects how brilliant he was. With these words, I thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.
The theme of the Muhammad Irfan Memorial Lecture is Becoming a Learning Organization, which will be delivered by Asim Ijaz Khwaja, who is the Sumitomo Foundation for Advanced Studies on International Development Professor of International Finance and Development at the Harvard Kennedy School, co-director of Evidence for Policy Design, and co-founder of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. His areas of interest include economic development, finance, education, political economy, institutions, and contract theory cum mechanism design. He has been published in leading economics journals and has received coverage by numerous media outlets. Professor Khwaja received BS degrees in economics and mathematics with computer science from MIT and a PhD in economics from Harvard University. The session will be chaired by Mr. Tariq Bajwa, the Governor, State Bank of Pakistan. Mr. Bajwa is a career civil servant by profession with varied experience in organizations such as the PIA, ERA, and UNDP. Mr. Bajwa holds a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, where he was awarded the prestigious Littauer Fellowship. Mr. Bajwa is on his way, so in the meantime, I invite Professor Asad Zaman to take his place on the stage. The discussants for the session are Professor Ahmed Masood Khalid, Dean and Professor of Economics, UBD School of Business and Economics, University of Brunei, Dar es Salaam. Professor Khalid, can you please join us on the stage? The second discussant is Professor Atar Maqsood Ahmed, who is Professor of Economics, S3H, School of Social Sciences, National University of Science and Technology, Islamabad. Now I hand over proceedings to Dr. Asad Zaman to conduct the...
Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this session. We are very excited to have Asim Khwaja with us, even though he cannot be in person. And let us just, without further ado, invite him to present his talk. Thank you.
Great. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also an honor. I heard the great things about your colleague, Dr. Irfan, so I'm honored to kind of be presenting in his memorial. Let me sort of jump straight into the talk. I understand there'll be discussants afterwards, and also hopefully we'll have a chance to talk. I apologize for not being there in person. Inshallah, I hope next time around I'll be able to do so. So let me just start. It was a very generous introduction, but let me kind of start quickly with a bit of information about myself, and I think it's relevant so you can understand where I'm coming for the topic of today. So I've been working on evidence-based policy making, mostly in Pakistan, for close to 2 decades now, in 3 big areas: finance, public finance, and human capital, broadly speaking. Today's talk, I'll mostly be drawing on finance. I understand the Governor Sahib will be here soon as well, and the expertise in the audience I thought would be of interest to people, and also sort of in line with the theme of the conference. A lot of the work that I do in my research is really very much in collaboration with practitioners, both public, private, and civil society actors. And one of the critical parts of this work is to both use data and theory to inform policy. So that's going to be a lot of what I'll talk about today. Before I begin, I did want to point out 2 organizations which very much do this and very much reflect the kind of lecture I'll give today in terms of the work that they do. One is the organization at Harvard, which is Evidence for Policy Design. This is the organization I'm part of. And the purpose of this organization is to really unite research and policy making. The other organization is in Pakistan, and I also represent this organization. This is the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. It's headquartered in Lahore. I understand Amna Mahmood is here today, and so if you're interested afterwards, you're welcome to talk to her. Amna, if you could just get up and identify yourself so individuals can talk to you if needed. But this is an organization which was co-founded by several of these economists I've listed over here, with the sole purpose of encouraging evidence-based policy making. I also happen to be an entrepreneur, and so in some of the talk that I'm giving today, I'll mention a company that I founded called the Entrepreneurial Finance Lab. And this company also reflects this idea of using data in decision making. That's going to be a major theme. So that's just the introduction. Let me start going now into some of the specifics of what I wanted to share with you all today. So first of all, one of the important things I think we need to realize, and several of you are influential in the audience, you run organizations, whether they be academic organizations or public sector organizations or even private sector organizations. And I think it's important to realize that smartness now is no longer just the accumulation of knowledge. An organization is smart, not just because it acquires knowledge, but only if it learns and experiments and continuously adapts. So these are very important criteria for organizations to adopt. And this would be true not just for public sector and private sector, but also civil society organizations. So I would encourage you to look back into your organizations and ask yourself whether the organization that you're part of or you're running, is it learning, experimenting, and adapting? Now, the signs of learning, experimenting, and adapting are very simple. You just need to be able to do 3 things. The first thing, so this is how do you learn? The first thing you need to be able to do is be open to information, be open to data. So that's kind of one of the most important criteria. And I would hazard, we tend to be close to information. We tend to not share information. And this is something with, if they are individuals from the Bureau of Statistics, I really appreciate the work they do for Pakistan, which is they produce data, they produce information. And for those of you researchers who are using this information, again, I feel like you're doing great service to the country by using more and more creative ways of data. The second thing you need to do is, in addition to using information, you need to be able to use theory. And this is a lot of what we do. We build models as economists, but not just as economists. Many disciplines use theory as a fundamental way. And theory is important because theory allows you to interpret the data. And then finally, the third step is you need to use data and theory to interact with each other, because theories are only good if they're tested by data. If a theory remains untested, if your view of the world remains untested, then that could also be very dangerous. So there's this constant interplay between theory and data. I think that's important to recognize if you're a learning organization. Okay, so let's take these three criteria: be open to data, use theory, and then use data to test and refine theory. Let's remember these three things. And now what I want to do is I want to actually go into some more specific details. I want to pose the following question. If you or we are in a learning structure or in a learning organization, how do we systematically make decisions? What does decision making look like? Okay. And I wanted to share with you a methodology that we've helped develop at Harvard, and a methodology that we're using in Pakistan. SERP is very much using this methodology in Pakistan, both in its work and also in its teaching. And this is a methodology, this is just one version of it, a methodology that allows for systematic analytical decision making in learning organizations. And I would encourage a lot of you sitting in the audience to see if you are already applying something like this, and if you're not, adapt this kind of methodology, because we find it incredibly helpful, again, in analytical decision making. So what I want to do is, for the rest of my lecture, I want to illustrate this methodology. So there are 6 steps in this methodology. You identify the problem, step 1. You diagnose the problem, step 2. You design solutions for the problem, step 3. You implement those solutions. You test those solutions, and finally you refine or improve your solutions. And this is very much an approach where you're in Islamabad. Islamabad is really where a lot of policy gets debated and discussed. My hope is that in every single department, in every organization in Pakistan, we try and follow a systematic process like this. What I'm going to do now in the remainder of the talk is I'm going to illustrate how this process works in an area that I've been very interested in, which is the area of finance. And so let me go through, literally apply. So all I'm doing now is I'm taking the methodology I introduced to you, and I'm simply illustrating it through an example in finance. So let's start with step 1. So step 1 is identify the problem. Now, I would argue that we often, in the act of policy making, we spend too little time on this step. Because what we often do is we take the first manifestation, the first illustration of the problem, and we never discuss it, we never refine it. And as a result, we often end up with the wrong problem. We end up solving the wrong problem. And that's a very dangerous step to be in, because if 2 years down the line you realize you have been solving the wrong problem, often it's too late to correct, or we're too embarrassed to admit that. And so we keep solving the wrong problem. And I've seen this happen over and over again. I teach public policy to lots of policymakers from across the world, and I often see many policies which are made like this, which were poorly defined to begin with. So let me give an example in finance. So the problem that I started my research work in about 20 years ago was I was very interested in seeing whether finance can be used as a mechanism for growth. Can finance increase growth? If you're the head of the state bank, like Bajwa Saab is, or if you're the finance minister, one of the main questions you ask is, can finance use to help Pakistan economy grow? Now, let's say you say, this is my problem. I want to start with this being the problem. I would argue that if we didn't refine this problem, we may end up in the wrong place. So let me give you an example of how we start refining this problem. We're in step 1. So first of all, use theory. So this is the standard model of economic growth that we use. Growth is a function of capital K, labor L, and A is TFP or productivity. This is the standard growth equation that economists use. What is critical in this growth equation is the role of capital K. So when we look at this growth equation, we say one of the critical problems you need to solve to get Y up, Y being output, GDP, is to increase K. That's one way of doing it. And as a result, we spend lots of time trying to finance growth. So I would, if I were there in person, I would love to have a more back and forth with the audience, but since we have limited time, I'm going to pose questions, and as I pose these questions, I want you to think while you're sitting there about how you'd answer that question. So let me give you a few seconds. So the question I'm posing you is, what do most countries do to finance growth? Okay. So think of our country, think of Pakistan, and ask yourself, what have we been doing to finance the growth process? Okay, hopefully that's enough. So let me suggest what you might have been thinking. So we do a lot of things, actually. We address the lack of money. When we think of financing growth, a lot of what we're obsessed about is raising capital. We raise capital through FDI, foreign direct investment. When the Minister of Economy or the Minister of Commerce or the Minister of Finance goes out to developed countries, often they meet investors in a hope that we can tell them how attractive Pakistan is. Despite what you read in the newspapers, Pakistan is a very attractive place. Please invest in Pakistan. We're raising money. We can also encourage domestic savings. You can tell individuals, save more. Okay, that's a way of financing growth. You can also, like Pakistan, rely on remittances. Foreign remittances are a major source of financing growth. So in this view of the world, that the constraint to growth is the lack of money, the problem you want to solve is how to attract money. In fact, no offense to the governor and other individuals who study finance, I think of finance very simply as plumbing. It's a very easy analogy. What does plumbing do? If you're a good plumbing system, a plumbing system basically takes water from a reservoir and it tries to get water to all the individuals. Right? There's a piping system, and each individual, the challenge is get water to the people who need water the most. The only difference in finance is instead of water, think of money, and instead of individuals, think of firms and investors and entrepreneurs. But the basic idea is the same. Deliver money to those who need money the most. In this formulation, we think growth doesn't happen because the level of water in the reservoir is too low. So we say, fill the reservoir up, and if you fill the reservoir up, you can get more growth, more money to people who need money, and they will help grow the economy. In fact, if you think of the latest tax bill in the US, why is the US president giving huge corporate cuts to cutting the corporate tax rate substantially? Well, one of the reasons is if you put money back in the hands of firms, they will help grow the economy. So the theory over here is put more money in the system and growth will happen. Okay? There are different ways of putting money in the system. I would question ourselves and say, when you look at Pakistan and an economy like Pakistan, do you think this is the problem? Is our problem the lack of money? If it is, then we should figure out how to solve it. But before we go there, this is a theory, let's use data to test the theory. Okay? So let's do that. So the question I now pose is the lack of money the real problem to focus on? Okay. So I'm going to give you two, and this is again, the example I want to give you is use a mix of theory and data to define and refine your problem. We're just in step one. I want to be able to use data and theory. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in data. Before it was just theory. So let me give you two pieces of data. The first is data from the world. So this graph that I'm hoping you're seeing now is from a book written by two of my colleagues, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. And this is a book which looks at 200 years of data, and it plots two graphs together. And for those of you who are good in statistics, I would like you to look at these two graphs and think for a second about what these two graphs are telling you. So the red line is the amount of money in the world. So red is good. When it gets high, there's more money in the world. There's more water in the reservoir. The blue line is actually a bad thing. The blue line is a fraction of the world which is in a financial crisis. Right? This is not where the governor or the Minister of Finance wants us to be. The more blue you have, the more banks are collapsing. And what is interesting is what do you see in this graph? What is the relationship between the red and the blue line? What is the relationship between capital mobility, or the amount of capital, and financial health of an economy? And if you look at this for a second, it's not that surprising that you see an interesting relationship. In fact, the relationship you see is counter to the theory I just told you. The relationship you see is if you put more money in the system, you get more financial crisis. Remember? So what we started was more money is a good thing. This graph says more money is a bad thing. Now you might say, if you're again good in statistics, Asad Zaman is here, who's an econometrician and a phenomenal one. Asad will say, this is not a causal relationship, this is a correlation. You haven't shown to me that money produces bad things, or more money produces bad things. And that's correct. So what we can do is we can turn to an experiment. Ideally, we want an experiment where a country got suddenly lots of money without any expectation of it, and then we want to see what happened to the country. Now, it's very hard to run that experiment. You might think the IMF and the World Bank is like that. They randomly give money to people, but there's usually a purpose to it. It turns out, actually, we have experiments like these. These are called natural experiments. So I have a paper with a colleague of mine called Professor Atif Mia, who's a leading finance economist at the Princeton University. In fact, he's one of the leading economists in understanding the US financial crisis in the world. So Atif and I had the chance, and I wanted to actually reach out and thank in particular the State Bank of Pakistan. At that stage, Dr. Ishrat Hussain was the governor. And we had the chance to study this question: what happens when you put in money into an economy in Pakistan? Right? And alhamdulillah, we got interesting results, but also I think we shed further light to this problem. So here is the data from that set of papers. So I want to show you the effect of 9/11. So the red line over here is 9/11. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is good stuff. You can think of it like that. The main effect of 9/11 is that Pakistan, and in fact most Muslim countries, get a huge inflow of capital. You know the reasons for this. There are many reasons for this, but there's essentially reverse capital flight. Rich Pakistanis bring money back in. And you see, to the left of the red line, you see foreign remittances are very flat. Right after the red line, right after 9/11, the amount of foreign remittances goes up massively. As a result, if you look at the graph on the right, the domestic interest rates drop. They drop from about 7% to, in about a year and a half, they're down to 2%. So there's more money, the cost of borrowing is low, and in fact, if you look at the foreign exchange reserves in Pakistan, the graph on the bottom left, you see foreign exchange reserves are going up. So this is an experiment where a country, in this case, our country, Pakistan, suddenly got lots of money. And not only did it get lots of money, business is booming. If you look at the bottom right panel, I'm showing you what we call the aggregate demand effect. What is happening to businesses? If you look at investment growth, export growth, or the default rate, all of these things suggest that the economy is booming. The reason it's booming is the construction sector starts booming because Afghanistan, after the 9/11, needs to be rebuilt. And guess which industry rebuilds them? Pakistan benefits from it. Our construction industry benefits from it. So now think of the experiment. This is a time where we get lots of money and business is good. So what you should expect to happen, if you believe the first theory, that more money helps growth, is that this money should get fueled and directed to all these businesses which are booming. So let me show you the other graphs now, which is a bit of the worrying news. And this is again thanks to access that the State Bank gave us to really incredible data. So a lot of the credit goes to the leadership of the State Bank. So this is what we find. The top two graphs show the amount of money lent to firms pre and post 9/11. And what you see is a very stark difference. So remember the graphs I showed before? When we went after 9/11, everything was going up. Now when you look at how much, and this is every loan made by every bank to every firm in Pakistan. So this is all lending in the country. and you can see nothing happens. So even though we put more water in the plumbing, there's very little water which is reaching the firms. In fact, the only place the water shows up, if you look at the Karachi Stock Exchange, this is the time when the Karachi Stock Exchange is booming. So instead of going to firms and the corporate sector, money is going to the stock exchange, and by the way, if you know the data on this, to the real estate markets. There's also a real estate boom going on over here. So now you go back to the question I asked first. Is more money a good thing for growth? And the answer seems to be, when a country like Pakistan got more money, it didn't give it to the people who typically would be investors, would be growers in the economy. It gave it to speculators in the economy. A very different process. Now, I don't want to beat on Pakistan. This is not a trend where Pakistan is the exception. This is probably the common thing for every country. The US is like this as well. Pakistan just has a nice way to study this. And what this suggests is that the problem may not be lack of water, but in fact, what do you think happens if you have too much water and your plumbing system has leaks in it? Your plumbing is not good. If your plumbing is not good, what happens when you put too much water is the water leaks out. In fact, sometimes the leakage gets worse. If you have a small leak and you put lots of pressure in your pipes, the pipe can burst. So this is a very different formulation of the problem. This says if you want money, if you want to use money to grow, the problem is not there is too little money. The problem is your plumbing is faulty. Your pipes are leaking. So again, if you're the governor of the state bank, sorry, I don't want to put Bajo Sahab on the spot, but if you're leadership in Pakistan in the financial sector, you should be worried, given this evidence, much more about fixing the piping system, plugging the pipes. Okay? Now, what does it mean to plug the pipes? You can talk, we can have lots of stories about why the pipes are leaky. Is it corruption? Is it inefficiency? Is it lack of competition? All of these stories could lead to leaky pipes. But the critical thing we have done is to say we have redefined our problem. So all I've done so far, I started with a problem which is I wanted to solve finance as a way of growing. I first said one reason could be lack of money. I theorized. I brought in data which said that doesn't look like the case. In fact, the data suggested that our problem is really leaky pipes, or in more formal terminology, friction in financial mediation. The financial markets have frictions in them. There's some friction which is preventing a bank from lending money to a firm. And again, for those of you in the Pakistan economy, you're aware of these frictions. If any one of you has ever tried to borrow money from a bank, you will understand what these frictions will be. If you're a banker and you've tried to lend money to a firm, you also understand what these frictions will be. But the main thing is we should think about solving these financial frictions. That is the problem we want to focus on, not the problem of lack of money. I'm not saying that second isn't a problem, but it seems like the first is, even if we get money, we still aren't able to use it well. So let's at least first solve the plumbing system. Okay, now we go to step 2. Now, think of how much time I spent on step 1. This is important. I would urge all of you to really, really take the time to do step 1 properly. The other step, which we ignore, is step 2, which is once you've defined your problem. So I have said my problem in this case in Pakistan is financial frictions. Once you've solved that problem, now you need to become a doctor. You need to diagnose the problem. Why is it happening? Right? And you need to be a good doctor. What does a good doctor mean? Imagine you come into a doctor and you're bleeding. And you tell the doctor, doctor, I'm sick, I think I'm bleeding. Can you diagnose me? And the doctor says to you, you're bleeding, that's your diagnosis. That's not a good doctor. You would fire that doctor instantly. Instead, you want a doctor who says, why are you bleeding? What is causing the bleeding? Is it an external injury? Is it an internal trauma? Is it hemorrhaging of some internal organ? Which organ? So that's called differential diagnosis. We again need to use theory and data to be able to diagnose properly. Okay, so how do we diagnose? So let's continue with the same example. So the problem was a lending problem. I said there's friction. Let's focus on lending, right? So let's think of the following very simple game. It's called the game of loans. The game is you're a lender and you want to lend money and make a profitable loan. And borrowers come to you. They ask you for money. And you have to make a very simple decision, yes or no. Okay? And the only challenge is that when you give the money, you have to make sure that it's paid back to you. Okay, so that's your challenge. So why is this problem hard? It seems like a simple problem. I just need to figure out who to give my money to make sure I get it back. So again, we should use theory. What does theory tell us how to theorize about this problem? So theory tells us that this problem has two parts to it. The first part is called a selection problem. If you're an investor, if you're a bank, you need to identify people who have high ability, who are good entrepreneurs. You give them a lakh rupees and they can pay you, they can make it into 2 lakh rupees, into 3 lakh rupees, because you're good business people. And the second thing you might also want is you want honest people. You want people that when they make the 3 lakh rupees, they don't run away with it. They pay you back. We have that problem as well, right? They might, a businessman might make money, and you might know several of these businessmen, but will they want to pay you back? They may not want to pay you back. So that's the selection problem. The second problem you have is something called a monitoring problem. Even if you get the right person, you want to make sure they do the right thing. You want to monitor them. If I gave you a lakh rupees to run your business, I want to make sure you take the lakh rupees and put it in your business, not that you buy a nice little bedroom or house in Jika Gali or something, right? I want you to run your business. So there's a chance that the investor may not do the right thing with the money. I also want you to repay the money. That's also behavior, right? I want to set up a system where repayment happens. So the problem of finance, of lending, is simply solving the selection problem and the monitoring problem. That's it. And we estimate in work that we've done that because of this problem, because of not being able to solve this problem well, we're missing about $4 trillion of GDP in the world. Millions of jobs across the world. Pakistan is no exception to this. Okay? So we really need to try and solve this problem. Now you might ask, well, we have banks, we have MFIs, microfinance organizations, and this angel you see is something called venture capital. We have equity investors. These are 3 lenders who give lots of money in most countries. This is true in Pakistan as well. Our venture capital industry is beginning to develop. We have a very large banking industry, and while we have, thanks to a lot of organizations in Pakistan, we have a very good microfinance sector as well. Kashaf, Akhuwat, First Microfinance Bank. We have many players in Pakistan. Okay? So I would go back to theory and ask yourself, how do these organizations solve the screening problem and the monitoring problem? Let me very quickly explain that. So how do banks do it? Banks solve the collateral problem, solve the selection problem by asking for collateral. Put up collateral and we'll lend to you. They also use credit scores, CIB databases, for instance, in Pakistan, right? The Credit Information Bureau. Now, while this is a good way to solve some problem, it also leads to problems. If you require collateral, you only lend money to rich people. What if you're a poor person and you have a good idea? Will you get money from a bank? Probably not. So that poor person who doesn't have collateral, doesn't have a credit history, doesn't have a rich uncle, but has a great idea, will not get money, and their idea will never happen, which means GDP is not happening. That's what it means to lose GDP. Okay? So that's banks. What about venture capitalists? Venture capitalists, Silicon Valley in the US. You know, people like venture capitalists a lot and they think venture capitalists solve a lot of problems. So what do venture capitalists do? They do screen people and ideas. If you're an entrepreneur, you walk up to a venture capitalist and you pitch your idea and they give money against your idea. But the problem is it takes a lot of effort to do that. That makes sense if you're going to build Google. But if you want to expand a mithai shop in Karachi, you're not going to go to venture capitalists and get money for expanding your mithai shop. Okay? Also, venture capitalists want to exit quickly. They don't want to stay with you. They want to sell you off very quickly. It's called fast exit. That's why we think of venture capitalists as vultures sometimes. We make fun and say they're not venture capitalists, they're vulture capitalists. Okay? They want quick exits. What about microfinance? Microfinance looks great, but again, ask yourself, how are they solving the screening problem and the monitoring problem? Okay? So often they solve these problems by asking your neighbor to tell you how good a person you are. It's called joint liability, social capital. But the question is, does your neighbor know if you're a good entrepreneur? If he's not a good entrepreneur, what does he or she know about entrepreneurship? That model may not solve the selection problem very well. Now, I'm being a bit unfair. I'm not saying these organizations, banks, microfinance, and venture capital is failing. I'm saying they're actually solving a really hard problem. The screening and monitoring problem is a very hard problem. We need to understand the problem. We need to diagnose it. So all I've done so far is I've diagnosed that your underlying problem is screening and monitoring, right? And I've told you that this is a hard problem to solve. So let's now go into step 3. So what has step 2 told me is solve the screening and monitoring problem. That's what you need to do. Forget about everything else. Don't worry about the terms. You know, I hate to say this with the governor and central bankers here. Forget about prudential regulations for a second. Right? Just solve the screening and monitoring problem. So let's think of designs to do that. What is the right design to do this? Now, there are many designs you can do this. And one of the things which is happening in the world is there is an information and data revolution happening. There is more information we have now, which is digitized, in the last 2 years than we have in the entire history of humanity before those 2 years. Think about that, what I just said. In 2 years, we have more data than we've ever had from beginning of time to 2015. That's the rate of data growth. We also have a technology revolution. I bet most of you sitting in the audience right now, in fact, I can see several of you are playing with your phones. So a lot of you have smartphones. By the way, if you gave me access to your smartphone data, I will know more about your life than your wife or your children do. That is how much information you're generating as you type away on your phones. So there is an information and a technology revolution going on. And I would argue that we should use this revolution, data and technology, to go back and solve the problem that I raised earlier, the problem of finance, of financial frictions, of screening and monitoring. Can we do that? Okay. So there are lots of models. This is called fintech, for those of you who don't know. This is coming in Pakistan. It's still very small. Financial technology firms. Some of these firms do things called peer-to-peer lending. People lend money to people. Forget about banks. We get rid of banks. All of you collectively go to a website and people pitch ideas on the website and you lend 1,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees as an investment. That's called peer-to-peer lending. So that's one model. The other model is a model that I have been working on for the last 10 years now, which is you start directly measuring. Remember the problem I told you was selection. What if I can just directly measure how honest a person is and how entrepreneurial a person is? So this is the idea behind something called the Entrepreneurial Finance Lab. This is a company I founded, so full disclosure over here. It started as a research lab at Harvard, and now it's a full-fledged company recently recognized by the Financial Times as one of the top 10 companies in fintech. Now, why is this special? Why is this recognition there? It's very simple. The idea is very simple, and that's what I want to illustrate to you. When you adopt a methodology like this, you don't have to do rocket science. This isn't complicated stuff. It's very simple stuff. It's just systematic. So the diagnosis we had done was selection and monitoring is the problem. And the question I'm posing myself is, can we solve this problem? So how do we solve this problem? What does EFL do? So EFL does the following thing. You walk up, any person in the audience right now can walk up to EFL and take a test. It takes 15 to 20 minutes now. And in the test, we measure your ability, which means your skills, your business skills, your intelligence, your IQ. We measure these things. And we measure what we call willingness to pay, which is how honest are you? What is your attitude? Are you a moral person? Think about each one of you. How do you make friends in life? How do you make partnerships in life? I bet each one of you is assessing. If I ask you to give money to some friend of yours, I bet you would know which friend to give money and which friend not to give money. Because you will say, this friend is high ability, but I don't trust him. He's my friend, but I don't trust him with money. This person, I trust him, but low ability. This person has both ability and trust. That's the person I'll put my money in. If we can do that, why can't a lender do the same? If we can measure these things. So that's the idea behind EFL, that we can measure these things. Now, this is something we designed. This was step 3, design a solution. Our solution was come up with a way of measuring these things. But one of the critical things is we should never be arrogant. No matter how good we think our policy is, and this is a lesson to all of us, and I speak to all of you and to myself, never think that when you come up with a policy reform, it is going to work. The only way to plan for success or to have success is to plan for failure. If you think your model will work, you are arrogant. We're not omniscient. We're not geniuses. Okay? Knowing that you will make mistakes means that you should be testing constantly what you're doing. So step 4 in our methodology is when you come up with your design, when you come up with your solution, and you're going to implement it, make sure you test it. Testing is very, very important. Again, this is where data comes in. For a lot of you who are economists in the audience, please, this is my request to you, encourage the people you work with to start being in this testing mode. Test any reform you do. Test every idea you do, because I guarantee it, that you will make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And the mistake is not to make mistakes. The mistake is not to learn from the mistakes. That's the real mistake. Okay? So let's go to the example I gave you. So we said, okay, we have this idea. I don't know if it works. Let's test it. So we test it. So how do we test it? So EFL tested it by going to a bank and saying the following. You have a way of lending. We have a way of lending. Let's lend to any person who basically passes either your test or my test. And let's see what happens. So the table I show below is this table. So think of the 4. It's a 2 by 2 table. The only people who don't get a loan are people that EFL says no to and the bank says no to. Okay? Normally the bank is only lending to the people in the column. Bank, yes. The 2 numbers I'm showing you are default rate and out of 1,000 people, how many people passed the test. And what you see is very interesting over here. If people pass both EFL's test and the bank's test, 181 people passed both tests. And the default rate for those people is 2.8%. It's pretty low. So they're good, safe investees, safe borrowers. And they're about 18%, 181 out of roughly 1,000 people. Okay. Now look at the people the bank said yes to and our test said no. The 55 people, the bank would lend money to them. They have collateral, they have whatever you want. But it turns out they're not that good. Their default rate is about 14.5%. But what is much worse is there are only 55 people like this. There are not that many people here. But the most interesting thing is the number where EFL says yes and the bank says no. Remember, these are the people who the bank will not give money to. So if you're trying to increase financial access in your country, these 677 people do not have financial access because the bank is saying no to them. EFL, however, says yes to them. And this is interesting. Look at the default rate they have. It's 9.7%. It's worse than 2.8, but it's better than 14.5. In fact, the bank had given us a target rate. This particular bank had said, we want less than 10%. We're okay with 10% default. So the main point we did is we tested this idea and we showed using data this idea works, but more importantly, this idea can increase the amount of money people get. So in the old world, only 181 plus 55, right? 236 people were getting money. In the new world, you've added another 677 people. You've tripled the number of people who can get money. So if you're looking for expanding financial access in your country, your banking model is not going to do it by itself. You need alternative models. That's what this is telling you. Okay? But it's not enough. You might say it's working, but you should never stop learning. We make another mistake. We test something and we think, khalas, test is done, we don't need to test again. Right? It's not like medicine where you make a medicine once and you've solved aspirin makes heart disease, the risk of heart attack be less. This is not the world we live in. The world we live in is policies keep changing, people keep changing, economies keep changing. So you need to be constantly testing and retesting, not just once. That's called refining. So in EFL, we did the same thing. Our initial test was working, but we kept on improving the test. Let me give you two examples. So we asked our question, does honesty make for a better borrower? You might ask yourself, is an honest person a better borrower? Again, give yourself a few seconds to think about this. If I were to ask you a question, is honesty lead to better credit worthiness? Now, I can tell lots of stories, I can theorize, but ultimately we should test it. When we tested it, we found a very interesting picture. We found this picture. The y-axis is default rate, the x-axis is honesty. So people who are the least honest are high defaulters. Dishonest people default more, that's true. But, and this is very interesting, if you're very honest, too honest, you actually also default a bit. So if you only care about, I'm not making a moral statement here, if you only care about default rates, some small amount of dishonesty is actually desirable. Again, I want to be very careful what I just said. I don't want people to quote me and say, Harvard professor says people should be dishonest. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you care about financial risk, and what does this mean? This means think of too much honesty as being naive. सीधा है, उर्दू में हम कहेंगे, बहुत ही सीधा है ये. अगर आपने बिजनेस में सर्वाइव करना है, you might need to have some amount of worldliness जिसे हम कहते हैं. थोड़ा सा आपको चालाकी दिखानी पड़ती है क्योंकि दुनिया बड़ी dishonest है. आपको लोग बेवकूफ बना लेंगे. Maybe that's what this data is saying. I don't know, but the data is telling us something. Similarly, let me ask you the following. Does optimism, if you're optimistic, are you a better borrower? These are all personalities. See what I'm doing. I'm not asking कि आपकी financial history क्या है, कि आपका ज़मीन कितनी है, कि collateral कितना है. I'm saying कि आपकी personality क्या है. I am tying your personality to financial behavior. So now I say optimism. If you're optimistic, are you a better borrower? Now this is very interesting. Again, think a few seconds before I give you the result here. Give you a few seconds to think about it. In your mind, in your experience, if you're optimistic, are you a better borrower? Turns out, it's very interesting. It differs depending on how old you are. If you're young, it's actually better to be a pessimist. A young person who is pessimistic is a safer risk. If you're older, it's the opposite. If you're an old person, if you're optimistic, you are safer. You have low credit default risk. Now again, I can tell stories about it. I won't. I'll let you figure these stories out. I'll also let you classify yourself as young or old. For me, the old age keeps moving up as I get older. So I still think I'm young. But you can imagine young and old could be somewhere around 35 to 50, depending on how you want to classify yourself. Okay, so again, the data is allowing you to refine your theory. It's not that optimism is important. Optimism interacts with age. It depends how old you are. Now, these aren't magic Coke recipes I'm giving you. This isn't the truth. This is simply what the data is telling you right now. If you stop learning, this model may change over time, and you will not know that. So the main insight I'm coming is not believe what I just said in terms of these results, but believe in the process. The process which is allowing you to test and refine your theory. Okay, let me end in a few more minutes because I'm out of my 45 minutes. The big point I'm making is in the world of finance, because of this testing, there's 3 new big solutions emerging. One is psychometrics, which is what I just did, testing personalities, lending against people's personalities. That's what the company I founded does. The other is mobile data. Pakistan is beginning to do this. Use cell phone data to start lending money to people. Okay. The third is online social media data, Facebook, WhatsApp, all of these sources, right? Skype, if you're talking on Skype, if you have histories, your Instagram, Twitter, use these sources to score data. Now, these are alternative sources of data. And again, you would only go here if you start with a systematic process. When you walk up to a banker, a typical traditional banker, and say, you should be using Facebook data to make a loan, they will look at you like you're mad. What do you mean? That doesn't make any sense. But you should tell them, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Selection and monitoring. How is this data that you have solving the problem? Making mistakes, but learning from our mistakes. So to summarize, where are we at? We gave you an example of this entire process. First, identify the problem. So remember, in the problem of finance, I said the problem is not lack of money, but financial frictions. Then we said diagnose the problem. We diagnosed, and I said screening and monitoring is the diagnosis. Then we wanted to design a particular solution. So I gave you one solution. There are many. I gave you one called EFL, this solution that I've been working on. Then I said, no matter how good your solution is, test it. So we ran a horse race. We compared the EFL solution with the bank's typical solution to see which one is working better. And then finally, we talked about this example of improving your model, improving your solution. This is a constant cycle. It never ends. This is a cycle of how we do evidence-based decision-making in our organizations. Doesn't matter what organization. In fact, I would argue this is how you all learned how to speak your first language. When you were children, how you learned knowledge is exactly the same process. You weren't conscious about it, but you had the same experimentation and iterative process. We need to apply that to our organizations if we are to reach a point that we can be learning, if we are to reach a point where policy making in our countries can be informed by evidence and theory and be systematic. Let me end with an offer of help. You know, it's easy for us to say these things. I'm sitting 5,000 miles away from you. You say this is nice, fancy talk, Asim, but this doesn't work. Let me assure you that this works, and it works in Pakistan. It works with Pakistani data. It works with Pakistani policymakers. It works with Pakistani problems. This is what I have been personally doing for 20 years. This is what the organization that I'm part of in Pakistan, SERP, has been doing for now 10 years. And to make it real, I'm happy to offer, Amna is here. You can talk to her afterwards. I'm happy to offer 2 ways we can help. I'm very committed to kind of getting this work done in Pakistan because inshallah, I think this will make us better, improve us in lots of ways. One, you can work with places like SERP. And by the way, there are many organizations now like SERP which are coming up, which is great. I'm very happy to see this. PIDE, I'm hoping, will go this direction. Organizations like Ideas, like AERC, like the Collective in Karachi, like SP, DI Islamabad. But the idea is, one, work in this style of engagements, this speedy engagement that I gave you, collaborate together, I've done many collaborations with government departments, with banks, with NGOs. So SERP's mission is to get the best researchers in the world to work with the practitioners and researchers in Pakistan to apply this style of work. And second, we should train people to do this at all levels, at senior levels, at mid-management levels, at technical ME levels. Again, SERP does this. Other organizations are beginning to do this. Please reach out to us, to these organizations, if you are interested in applying these ideas, or if you're interested in teaching these methods in your own engagements. Let me stop over here. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I know it's late for you, so thank you so much. And I'm happy to now get both comments, but also feedback from the discussants.
So once again, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. First of all, my apologies for being late for a few minutes. As you know, the IMF mission is in town, and we were having some hard-nosed discussions with them. So I could, as soon as I could get myself out, I came here. Asim, a very interesting thought, a very good presentation. I think it has, some of us may agree with you, some of us may partially agree with you, and some of us may not agree with you, but I think you've set all of us thinking. And I think that probably was the core purpose of your presentation also. What is it that we can do as far as financial intermediation is concerned, and how is it that we can improve that? I have some of my thoughts on those, but before I come to that, I think I'll start from where you finished. And at least as the regulator, I will take you up on the offer that you just made. I have my chief economist with me here, and he will be in touch with you and seeing how SERP can help us in implementing some of the pilot tests on the ideas that you have. We're working on different pilots. Dr. Ali Chaudhary is here, and they will be in touch with you and seeing how we can run a pilot on this one also. Before I come give my concluding remarks, we have two discussants here. We started with 3, but I think we have 2 at the moment. So let me introduce the discussants to you, and then I'll request them for their views. Our first discussant is Professor Ahmed Khalid, who is a Bond University professor with a PhD in economics from the Johns Hopkins University. And our second discussant is Dr. Atar Masood Ahmed, one of Pakistan's eminent economists. He is the founder of the Department of Economics at the National University of Sciences and Technology. So I would ask first Professor Ahmed Khalid's views, and what I've been given to understand is that you have 5 minutes for your views. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank PIDE for organizing this very important memorial session for Dr. Irfan, who made valuable contribution not only to PIDE but also for the field of economics. Very thought-provoking and intellectual talk by Dr. Asim Khwaja. I must admit to Professor Khwaja that and to audience that I was only provided this slides while I was in transit, so I had to in between my flights I had to make some comments on that. So some of the comments, I think more clarity I got while you were talking, so I'll make some comments on that. The first thing is some comments, in fact, I'm going to make, and then some of very general comments I'll make, and I'll try to make it in 5-7 minutes. The first thing is about the data that you mentioned about smart learning. The issue that we have, and you very rightly said, Dr. Khwaja said that is an important issue. Is the data reliable? Is the data available? And I think some of these the innovations in technology may help us to have more reliable and timely available data. So we look forward to that. I have some comments about the use of theory and use data to test and redefine theory. Is a very intellectual question, in fact, whether we really use theory or our empirical results that we have in most of the research in economics and finance are dictated by the models and methodology, by the methodology and the data. So I think that's one comment that perhaps not directly relevant to the work that you are doing, but in general, I would like to make. This is basically the model, and I will not follow the slides, but very quickly. I do agree with Professor Khwaja about the finance, the money, the inflow of money, FDI in the right sector, and the governor also mentioned the same thing. Financial liberalization without regulations, we have seen the outcome of that. It's not a problem with Pakistan, it's not a problem with the region, it's a global problem. The reason of what happened in the global financial crisis was the lack of regulation. The paper does mention about asymmetric information. Is it really asymmetric information that we have the issue? The information is perhaps available, but we ignore that. We know who are the bad credit risk and good credit risk, but for certain reasons, again, my point is not for Pakistan, it's a global issue. The cause of the global financial crisis was, again, not asymmetric information. The information was there, but it was not properly used in that sense. So that's some of these issues. Can we deal with what type of technology or technological development if we just close our eyes and look into it? Some comments very quickly I'll make is the in terms of the learning organization in general, and my comments are more in macroeconomic perspective. As I said, I just had access to this to your complete slides only yesterday. We have a problem of lack of direction in Pakistan, especially in Pakistan perspective. What is the direction? We have been experimenting a number of development model, growth models, but none of the model has been implemented in its full, and that's perhaps a reason that our many efforts did not prove to be successful. Professor Zaman this morning did mention about the number game in a way when when you were talking about the quality and the quantity. I think that's another very important issue that we have is most of the work, research that we are dealing with is how many papers do we have without any relevance of to what is the actual issue that the country, any country faces, and whether those issues are relevant and how they should be dealt with. 2 more points I will make, and I'll finish with that, is the risk of reform reversal. That's a major risk that we have. Pakistan has suffered with that risk. A reform does not lead you to higher growth rate as much as the reversal of reform pushes you backward. So it creates a lot of uncertainty, and it takes a long time, decades, I would say, to get back to the track if you are lucky. The other thing that I observed with my work, with my very frequent visits to Pakistan, dealing with different organizations, is a very different model. If I compare with a country like Singapore, when you have this entry of foreign firms, the main reason of entry of foreign firms is to increase and is to have a better competition, where foreign firms will come, will put a pressure on domestic firms will improve, productivity will increase, and everyone will be happy. In Pakistan, that's not the way. It's the peer pressure with reverse causality. Foreign firm comes, they look at domestic firms do not change, eventually the quality of foreign firms goes down. And that is a good example of that is the banking sector. So many foreign banks came to Pakistan, and all these banks made some money and left. And we are still, after 3 decades of this foreign banks entry, our banking system is still not at a level where we can say, well, we have the most efficient banking system in the region. So I think I will not. Okay. Anyway, let us stop anyway. So I'll finish with that, and I thank you again. Thanks so very much, PIDE, for giving me this opportunity to make some comments on this very important topic. And I wanted to make a comment on a very important issue these days, which is the one bed, one road, or what we are more familiar in Pakistan with CPAC, but I decided not to make a comment because there is a full session tomorrow, so perhaps you will have more, but if anyone has a question, I will be happy to answer that question. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I will also like to make dua maghfirat for Dr. Irfan, who was my senior and mentor. May Allah grant him peace wherever he is. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege of listening to Professor Asim Khwaja on various occasions, and I am always impressed by his imaginative ideas, clarity of concepts, and lucid exposition. Today's presentation has not been any different than earlier on. About 25 years ago, a paper was written by Menkev, David Romer, and David Weil about growth theory, and they started their paper by stating that we take Robert Solow's work seriously. Same is applied here, despite all the caricatures and the brevity and only slides, not paper. I also take the work of Dr. Khwaja seriously because there is content in it. Now, coming to the discussion, he starts off with the proposition that being smart, you have to be constantly learning, experimenting, adapting. For this, you have to identify the problem, you have to collect evidence, and you use theory again and again, and then you have to make right decisions. Most of the starters possess one of the factors of production, and that we know, and that is labor. Labor is either unskilled or skilled. Thus, we define labor as effective labor if it is skilled and educated. It has to be combined with capital, which is finance in this particular case. The major constraint, obviously, is how to get access to this finance. Traditionally, we have two models that are very obvious for provision of finances. One is the formal financing sector, where collateral takes the central position, and the other one is the informal financing, where trust plays the central position. Both concepts are not new. The first one is we have common understanding about it. The second one, let me give you 2 or 3 examples. One is farmer Hari in our country. When he needs financing, he goes to the middleman for seed and fertilizer. At the end of the crop, he sells that crop, and there is a trust that goes on in this relationship. We also see similar informal type of borrowing by around the corner grocery store, which we call Karyana stores in our language, where the retailers, they just get the supplies from the supply chain operators, and they get it on credit basis, and at the end of the sales, they just pay it after the week or so. More recently, this concept is also applicable in the incubation centers, like the one we have in NUST also, where we provide space to young students who are imaginative, innovative, and they sit there without any rental cost, and we also provide them internet facilities. They develop their software, they develop their innovation products, and they just go away when they are established. Only thing what they do is, at the end of their success, either they repay the university or they donate handsomely to the endowment fund of the university. So there is this type of arrangement going on. So what we see these formal or informal channels, that there is credit available either through collateral or through this feeling of trust. There is no denying the fact that there are problems with the 4 steps that are mentioned in the paper, and there are leaky pipes, and there are financial frictions in the system, in every friction. The model designed by the author is traditional in nature, I would say that, but the use of technology and modern inputs makes it different. Like the base model and its various extensions, screening and monitoring problem are central. Furthermore, aspect of honesty and integrity and optimism add additional risks. Unfortunately, there is not much discussion on these risks except for the psychometric test and some non-conventional discussion about honesty and optimism. Since this model is working, I hope EFL, which is Entrepreneurial Financial Lab, turns out to be a success, and Professor Asim succeeds as an entrepreneur. Thank you.
Professor Asim, would you like to respond before I give my concluding remarks?
Let me respond very briefly. These are brilliant comments. I thank both discussants. I also thank Bajwa Saab. As I'd said earlier, I owe a lot of debt to the State Bank of Pakistan for a lot of the intellectual work I've been able to do. So I always like publicly acknowledging that. So I wanted to start by thanking Bajwa Saab and the State Bank for all the support they've done over the years. In terms of the comments, and in fact, I'd love to hear from Bajwa Saab as well, some of these ideas. You know, he is currently the central bank governor, and I think it's going to be really important to hear from him as well. Very briefly, in response to kind of the discussants, I pretty much agree with everything the discussant said. In the first discussion, I think the idea of competition, of regulation, and how we manage risk, I completely agree. In fact, the point I'm trying to make is, how do we design financial systems better to allow for learning and adaptation to happen, which means the right mix of regulation so that we prevent excesses, but also regulation that doesn't kill innovation. So you have to have this balance. I like the word prudential regulation. I think that's the word kind of to be thinking about. In terms of the person from NAS, sorry.
Dr. Athar.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
In terms of the discussion from NAS, I again completely agree with the comments made. I think they're spot on. The model that I was proposing is very much this traditional idea of trust, in exactly the way he said, both in terms of trade credit, informal sources. I love the idea of incubation centers. I've had the chance to do some work with NUST, and actually I'm very impressed by their incubation center as well. But this idea of tradition meeting technology, I think, is a really good summary of what I was suggesting. So let me stop there, and then I'm happy to open up for questions if there's time, or comments from Bajwa Saab or others.
So if there are any questions from the audience, I think we can take 3 questions, because we have another, Chancellor Saab tells me we have another 10-15 minutes, so we can take 3 questions.
Hello, my name is Kashif and I'm a student of Development Studies. My question from Asim Ijaz Khwaja Sahab is that you have said that we can take data from the social media and the mobile phones and some other means, as you have mentioned, but as we study, we have, research ethics and all the things, we have to take care of them. So if we can, get the data from mobiles, it will be very, getting into someone's personal spaces. And secondly, the model is, which I think, is that it's like it, you know, it is for the specific, you know, targeting the specific peoples which can use the internet and give you test on like psychometric analysis and all the things. But those who have good ideas, but maybe they cannot read or write the few things. So is there any alternative to these things? Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, Asim. This is Ali. Just a couple of
Hey,
questions.
Assalamu alaikum, how are you?
Very well, very well. We meet again. Okay, what's the loan size like at the EFL?
Ali, can you speak louder? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm saying what's the loan size like? That's the first question. And the second question is, have you compared the use of psychometric relative to data from Facebook, data from WhatsApp, and if so, and it could only be done in a randomized control trial setup, right? The same guys, and you try to, what's the situation on psychometric tests? Do they perform better or not? We leave it to that. Is there a paper on this that I could read upon?
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Khwaja. Saddam is here from State Bank of Pakistan. You mentioned that the information is available, we just need to extract this information from the sources like psychometrics and social media and things like that. So there is a cost associated with information collection, because in reality, asymmetric information prevails, and if you want to get information, then there is a price associated with that. So ultimately, who's going to pay for this information? Because the private labs, they more care for profit. And if we talk about government, then the development budget is really not sufficient to meet this price of information. So who is going to pay for this information collection? Thank you.
Can someone repeat that question? I had a really hard time. Was it about misinformation or disinformation?
No. It was basically about the cost of information, especially in countries in which the availability of resources are not that much.
Okay. Mahmood, do you want me to respond to these quickly? And
I think, yes.
Thank you. These are fabulous questions. I apologize, in the time that we have, it's hard to do full justice to these. Let me start in the order they were asked. I think the first question on privacy is absolutely first order. It's super important, and I think we need to decide as we, I'm glad Bajwa Sahib is here as well, as we think of regulation in this sector, we need to think very carefully about how this data should be used and can be used. My personal view on this is that the data should be owned by the individual generating the data. So very much, I think the way I would like to see the world is, if you are a borrower and you want to basically share your data, and if that helps you getting whatever services you want, then you should be allowed to share your data. But without your permission, I don't think we should be sharing this information. So I think that's my stance. It turns out the way the regulation is working out in most countries is there are big lobbying interests over here. So the large players in this world, Facebook, Google, large telcos, obviously are pushing for them owning the data. I think that debate will work out, but I agree these issues need to be discussed fully. I think a country like Pakistan needs to think very carefully about how it wants to proceed over here. In terms of the technology or illiteracy, that's actually not a problem. A lot of these tests, not just EFLs, are moving more and more to various devices. First of all, smartphone penetration is massively increasing, but people are doing these tests on feature phones. They're also doing these tests so that they can hit illiterate population. We've done it in the past. So it's not as big a hurdle as you might think. In terms of the loan size, Ali, your question, the loan sizes that EFL has done, they've made about 1 million or so loans by now, or tested 1 million or so people. Lending is about $1.5 billion overall, but the amount of lending loan sizes go anywhere from a few $100s to something like $100,000 as well, depending on which country they're working in and which partner they're working in. So it spans a pretty wide range. I would say it falls short of like large VC money, but pretty much the entire range of microfinance, mesofinance, small firm finance, I think is covered. Obviously, the model could change slightly depending on the segment you're looking at. Ali, your last part I didn't hear very well, but I think you were asking whether there is a study or there's a paper on this. Is that correct?
No. Compare psychometrics with Facebook, Twitter, etc.
Oh yes. So Ali, we've started doing that a bit. So EFL recently started using other forms of data as well, and we've started running horse races between the two. And what we're finding is psychometrics actually is outperforming, but what is more interesting is these are complementary sources. So for instance, when you combine psychometrics with social, with credit history, like normal financial data, the model improves even more. So there's positive complementarity in these things. So our ideal would be use all of this. There's no one dominant source. Use as much as you can. That would be kind of our view because they all add to each other. Again, I would encourage, Ali, I know you've been very creative and sort of pushing innovation in the state bank. I would encourage you guys to think about ways of systematizing data flows. In addition, like, is there a way to broaden CIB? That's very ambitious. I haven't seen any central credit registry do that in any country, but Pakistan, inshallah, can innovate. If you can think of ways to kind of make that data available so that others can use it, provided privacy issues are protected, I think it would be an amazing kind of innovation. That also relates to, I think, this cost of information. I really think the cost of information is falling drastically. The cost is not the technology cost. The cost is regulation. So if instance, Facebook decides it doesn't want to share data with you, even if it benefits your country, that's a classic pricing problem. One of the reasons we rate the availability of social media and sometimes CDR data is low is it requires you to make a deal with a telco or with Facebook. If tomorrow the telco or Facebook decides to stop giving you the data, there's nothing you can do. So this comes back to this idea that I'd be really interested in is, can we get ownership of the data back to the person? And if you can give it to the person, then I think the cost of acquiring can be very low. What we do need is good regulation over here. We do need innovation in a way that a player like the State Bank, again, I'm sorry to put you guys on the spot always, but I feel like leadership from the State Bank and this could be really powerful. You can generate a massive public good for Pakistan if we start thinking seriously about it.
Dr. Asad Zaman, Chancellor PIDE, Professor Asim Ijaz Khwaja, discussants Ahmed Masood Khalid, Dr. Athar Maqsood, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum once again and good evening. It's really a privilege to be here to chair this session. And as you found out, it was a very interesting presentation and some very apt remarks that came from the discussants. I think if you look at the core fundamentals of how to become a learning organization, there were 3 elements to it. And the elements were that, first of all, you have to be open to data. And I interpret it as for an organization to take decisions which are evidence-based. And the second is to use theory, which should be our touchstone. If things are moving in a direction other than what the theory suggests, then we need to look under the hood and see what is it that is different and why is it that is different from the theory. So we must be inquisitive, we must be challenging the data that is coming, which is if it is different from the theory that we have. And of course, is to use to data to test and refine the theory. And that is the mid-course corrections that we would be doing for any policy or any new program that would be launching. So I think these are important 3 elements that we should be looking, any organization that wants to be a learning organization should be looking into. Now coming to State Bank, and as the head of the banking regulator, and some of the, how is it that we are linking some of these things that have been discussed with what we are doing, I'd like to share with you that in the last 5 months since I have been in office, we have, based on the data, we have identified 3 priority sectors and 2 cross-cutting themes. The priority sectors that we have identified in the bank are those which we think can contribute directly and in the shortest period of time to growth in the economy. And those are, one is agriculture production loans. The second is SME financing, and the third is low-cost housing. Agriculture, of course, is a no-brainer. It contributes 20% to our GDP, 40% of our labor force is directly engaged with it, and it has the shortest gestation period. You can have results in a crop cycle which could be anywhere between 90 to 120 days. If you bring the right mix into the agriculture sector, you have immediate results. Even if you want to set up a mid-sized industry, it is going to take you a few years before you actually move into commercial production. In agriculture, the gestation period is the shortest. We're only talking about few months. And when we did our analysis and we looked at the broad numbers, there has been a growth in agriculture credit which is being passed on by the banks if you look at the broad numbers. Last year, it moved to 700 billion. But when you looked at the disaggregated data, we discovered that the loans which were being production loans which were being passed on to the farmers, but for the microfinancing institutions and the banks, they were less than the previous year. So something was not correct. And that is the correction that we are trying to make this year. There must be, if we are lending to the agriculture sector, it must be a productive loan and largely targeted to the small farmer. And this is the focus that we have for this year, and that's we use our data. And we are going to have a mid-course review of it in January, and then we are going to make the mid-course correction. So we're trying to learn or follow some of the elements that you have suggested. So agriculture, of course, is going to be one of our primary focuses as far as pushing of credit is concerned. The second area or a second priority that we have is going to be SMEs. And we have done a lot of deliberation on the small and medium enterprise financing. And the numbers that we have seen is that in 2006 and 2007, from a high of 17% of total credit which was being given to the SMEs, it has come down to as low as 7%. So the banks have not done what they were supposed to do. So we have done a full diagnostic of it. We have had internal discussions, we have had external discussions, we had stakeholder consultations, and by the third week of this month, we are going to come up with a new SME financing policy. We have tried to cover, we have first identified why is it that SME financing has dropped from 17% to 7%. And it included everything. It included the forms, plethora of forms that you have to fill. It included educating the bankers. It included educating the entrepreneurs. So we tried to cover all our bases to come up with a comprehensive policy, as a result of which we would be directing the banks to improve and giving them a target also, and also giving them that regulatory comfort that they need to come up with an increase in the credit which is available and which is given to the SMEs. If you want to have sustainable high growth in our industrial sector, SMEs must be brought up. The most vivid examples of industrial growth, of industrialization, are all based on a very robust small and medium sector. And that's what we are trying to do. We're also looking at what is the niche ability of different organizations and how is it that we can cash in on that. The microfinance institutions have a big footprint. Their presence is there at the local level. Can we use them in the concept of the Landesbanks of Germany to develop interpersonal relationships? And based on those interpersonal relationships, that is what would help them in providing loans also. So we're looking at all aspects of that, and I think by the third week of this month, we're going to come up with it. And the third priority sector, of course, is going to be low-cost housing. There's a gap in the housing units runs into close to 6 to 7 million. And that gap is increasing every day. And there's very little that is being done formally in that sector. If you want to build a house, you save money or you borrow from your relatives and then you start building your house. But there's very little formal credit that is being pushed to the low-cost housing. And housing is important because of its contribution to the economy. The estimates there are different estimates. Some estimates would suggest that construction sector triggers growth in 17 sectors in the economy. Other estimates are even higher. So we think that if we want to have across the board growth in the economy, we need to push formal credit to low-cost housing where there's a huge demand, and that is going to trigger further growth in the economy. So that's the third priority sector that we have. The two cross-cutting themes that we have, and I'll quickly share those with you. The first is financial inclusion. Financial inclusion because that brings empowerment. Yes, the law states you have all have equal rights, but unless you are empowered, it's just like saying, everybody can compete for a job, but you have a minimum qualification of being a metric. So unless everyone is a matriculate, it is not truly providing equal opportunity to all citizens. So similarly, in financial inclusion also, unless you have financially included, unless you are part of the system of financing, you cannot borrow formally, you cannot transact financial transactions, so you have a handicap. And if we look at financial inclusion, and that's also where we have looked at data and tried to look at under the hood, we are talking about financial inclusion at all levels, at income levels, at regional disparities, at gender disparities that we have. The regional disparities are also huge. You look at Balochistan, it's a huge landmass. The total deposits in the banks from Balochistan are 2%, low. But just think of a number. What are the advances that are going into Balochistan? 0.2%. Now that is the correction that we need to make. And that is where we are pushing the banks. We are pushing the banks to empower their regional offices, to empower even their managers, so that they can develop relationships, and based on the relationship, they are able to push credit there. So we are, as far as the financial inclusion is concerned, we are looking at all disparities that we have. And the second cross-cutting theme is Islamic financing. Not just because of its name. Of course, we are all Muslims, it's an Islamic state, and we need to encourage that. But also as an instrument to encourage saving. There was a survey done in which 74% of those who responded to the survey responded positively to Islamic banking. They said, yes, we are going to put deposits in Islamic banking. But we don't see those deposits yet in our Islamic banking systems. And I think that's a communication problem that we have. We need to communicate to the people that the banking that we do have is truly Islamic banking. And if we are able to do that, people would be bringing the money from under the mattresses and putting it into the system. And that is where our saving rates, which are abysmally low, are going to improve. So we are using it not only as an instrument of introducing a Sharia-compliant financial instrument, but also as an instrument to improve our saving rates, which is of course, and there is general agreement that it's very low. Now we are also trying with different ideas. As knowing our customer, the CIB that we have talked, we have an electronic CIB. We are also in discussions with different parties with saying how is it that we can put more meat to the skeleton that we have in the CIB. And that is using some of the social data that is available on the social media. So we are discussing it with them also. So we will be doing a pilot on that also and seeing how is it that we go forward on that. So at the bank, as I said, we are moving with different directions. Our priorities are clear, the cross-cutting themes are clear, and these are the directions that we'd want to move in. Some of the good news that I would want to share with the audience is that as we speak, the credit offtake to the private sector has seen a phenomenal growth in the previous year. And it is not just credit to the private sector, it is credit to the private sector for fixed investment. that last year grew on an year-on-year basis by almost 60%. So that shows a lot of investor confidence in Pakistan. At the same time, if you look at our imports, of course they are going through the roof. But when you do this, as I said, you disaggregate the data, you look at each set, you'll also see that the machinery group of imports is also growing by 40%. So again, this money that is being spent is being spent well. We are spending it for fixed investment. New machinery is coming up. Some of them are going to be greenfield projects. Some of them are going to be BMR projects. But all of them are going to add to our productive capacity. So I have a lot of confidence in the near future of Pakistan's economy. And that's the confidence that the investor has also shown. The foreign investor, the FDI, the foreign direct investment into Pakistan in the first 4 or 5 months has increased again by a huge number. I must confess from a narrow base, but also it has increased by about 70% plus. So there's confidence in the economy from the domestic investor, there's a confidence in the economy from the foreign investor. It's not to say that we don't have challenges. We do have challenges. The current account deficit is a big challenge that we have. The movement that you're seeing in exchange rates is a response to that challenge. The response to the challenge has come at a time when we are responding to it from a position of strength after having been to the capital market. We have been able to add to our reserves, and from that position of strength, we've been able to now allow the exchange rate to move closer to the equilibrium. The other challenge that we have is the fiscal deficit. And for that also, I think it will be contained this year because the largest contributor to the fiscal resources is FBR revenues. And FBR revenues in the last 5 months have been good. They've been on target. So I think for this year and for the next few years, we are on track. We are on track for high sustainable growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you, Professor Asim Ijaz Khwaja, for sparing time and being with us for this 33rd Annual General Meeting and Conference. Okay, so this is almost close of today's session, and I'm very sure that everybody must have taken the key messages and good things from today's lecture, starting from Professor Ataur Rahman's lecture and concluding at Dr. Asim Ijaz Khwaja's lecture. So now we have a small souvenir presentation. Unfortunately, Asim is not here, so we are not going to present him a shield, but we have shields for the chair of the session, the discussants for this session, and we have a memorial shield for Dr. Muhammad Irfan's family also with us. So I'm going to first request Mr. Tariq Bajwa to please come forward.
I just wanted to also just comment and thank Bajwa Saab. Bajwa Saab, I couldn't be more excited by your comments, so Jazakallah for sharing them. I'm thrilled that since you're one of our graduates from many years ago, I'm thrilled to hear these ideas actually at play. So I'm very excited. Inshallah, I hope we get a chance to talk more about these things.
So if you can please come over here. The first is the Muhammad Irfan's memorial shield provided to son of Dr. Muhammad Irfan. Next is honoring the Governor State Bank for sparing time for this session. We tried last year also to have the Governor State Bank, but we couldn't make it. So gladly this year. Thank you, sir. And now I would like to request our discussants, Professor Ahmed Masood Khalid first, to please small conference memento. Actually, he is also invited in a few other sessions, so we have made shields there also. So now Professor Atar Maqsood Ahmed. So now we officially close today's session.